Ever since the 4th century BC, Plato has consistently been considered one of the greatest philosophers of all time. Even today, after all the supposed progress that philosophy has made over the millennia, there are still some who maintain that the entire history of Western philosophy consists in footnotes to Plato. So what if you're curious to find out about Plato the man? How can you do that? Well, up until recently, there has never been a biography of Plato available in English. Nobody went through the trouble to go through all of the evidence which is scattered across many fragments and attestations throughout the ancient literature. So nobody bothered to go through all of that and collect it and filter out fact from fiction, combine it, analyze it, and present it in a digestible and enjoyable book until now. So in today's episode, we will be talking to the author of this new biography to find out who Plato really was. Our guest today is Robin Waterfield, an independent scholar, well-known translator of ancient Greek philosophers and historians, and a prolific author on all things related to ancient Greek philosophy and history, as well as the author of the new and first full biography of Plato in English. Robin Waterfield, welcome to Ancient Greece Declassified.
Thank you very much, Jack. Thanks for the opportunity.
So in your writings and interviews, you've used the word genius a few times to describe Plato. So what does that mean to you to say that he was a genius?
I think primarily I think of someone as a genius if they invent a new field of endeavor or study, or completely radically change the field they're working in such a way that everybody who comes after them has to adapt what they do to him to a certain extent. Plato was not a genius in the first sense. There had been plenty of thinkers before him, philosophers before him, but he was a genius in the second sense. He changed philosophy, the subject of philosophy, so thoroughly that, as I say, everybody had to react to what he'd done.
And I guess we're still reacting today?
We're still reacting today. I'm one of those people who actually believe that Whitehead was right when he said that basically the history of Western philosophy consists of footnotes to Plato.
If he was a genius of this caliber and, we're still reacting to him now when we do philosophy in some sense, what do you think were the sources of his genius? Like what was exceptional about his upbringing or circumstances that led him to become Plato?
Well, he grew up in ancient Athens at the end of the 5th century, unfortunately at a time when Athens was at war, but Athens was still a highly cultured city, and Plato belonged to the wealthy elite, so he had leisure time to study, to meet like-minded people, particularly, of course, the group of people surrounding Socrates. So there was that, his being fortunate enough to be born in Athens. Secondly, of course, there were his predecessors whose work he could reflect on, particularly the pre-Socratics, and then the greatest influence on his life was Socrates himself. And then his native genius, of course. He was born that way. So that's a part of it as well.
Let's rewind a bit to Plato's childhood. What do we know about his early years?
We actually know very little, but we can infer quite a lot because we know the kinds of things that happened to the children of the upper classes, as Plato was. So we know the kind of schooling he would have had and so on. And then we've got a number of ancient biographies written many hundreds of years after Plato's life in some cases, at least several hundred years in all cases. And they're mostly very brief, but occasionally they give us snippets about his childhood, such as that in his teenage years, he wanted to be a writer of some kind.
Do you believe the accounts that he wanted to become a writer of theater plays?
I'm not sure about that. It's possible. I see him more as an epigrammist, though, than a dramatist, but it's possible, but he never did, so I don't know.
Okay, so he had these tendencies towards literature, towards writing, but then he met Socrates, right? Is that what derailed him in that career path?
No, I think the two would have been compatible. I mean, quite a lot of Plato's fellow Socratics went on to be both active in the public world and writers, like Xenophon, professional soldier.
During that whole period, Plato traditionally has been seen as being a student of Socrates. How close do you think their relationship was? Like, how was he really a frequent associate of Socrates, or might he have been a more distant observer of the Socratic circle?
No, I think he was close, but it's impossible to give precise answers as to how close or how long he spent with Socrates, particularly since after Socrates' death, it wasn't just Plato, but a whole bunch of other Socratics who started writing, and in a couple of other cases founded their own school, as Plato founded the academy.
There's all these other Socratic authors, of whom only Xenophon survives in full, but we have fragments of other writers of Socratic dialogues, and the Socrates that they portray differs quite a bit from author to author, right? So when you see that variety, you might be tempted to think that none of these are really historical accounts and that there's a kind of fan fiction that emerged.
That is exactly what I think. And I have, in fact, written a scholarly article on it. I mean, just to take Plato's case alone, he has Socrates as the protagonist of these short dialogues that we think are early, where he's doing basically just inquiring into things. But he's also the protagonist of the dialogues we think of as Plato's middle period, which are far less inquiries, although they keep the dialogue form of question and answer, but far more doctrine building is going on than just leaving things open by inquiry. So just to take Plato alone, we've got two completely different portraits of Socrates. They can't both be right. And as you say, the portrait that Xenophon gives can't be right if one of Plato's is right. But scholars almost all of them think or pretend to think that the Socrates we get in Plato's early dialogues is the genuine one. And I say pretend to think because even if that's wrong, it's very interesting Socrates and well worth talking to and thinking with.
Well, I ask partly because, the standard portrait for thousands of years has been that Plato was a devoted acolyte of Socrates, his most brilliant disciple, following him around, absorbing all the wisdom, and then Socrates is forced to kill himself, and then Plato is devastated and then spends his life continuing that legacy. But how could you disprove the following alternative scenario, that Plato's older brothers were part of that circle, he knew other people who were in that circle, and he had occasional interactions with that circle, but then after Socrates died and became like a cult hero and a protagonist in a whole genre of fan fiction, then Plato realized the power of this medium and decided to write better Socratic dialogues than everybody else, even though he wasn't as close to Socrates as some of the other writers. Like, is that conceivable at all?
Well, everything is conceivable, but I don't think that's right. No. When he mentions Socrates, there's too much warmth. I hold him to be the wisest and the most courageous man ever. That sort of thing.
All right. So what do you think was the biggest lesson or lessons that Plato got from Socrates?
Two words. Keep inquiring.
Please elaborate on those two words.
Don't close philosophical doors. Keep asking questions. You might reach a conclusion, but don't consider it to be a final conclusion. Keep inquiring.
How much of the very elaborate method of question and answer that we find in the Platonic dialogues, how much of that do you think was developed by Socrates himself?
Yes, I've just put my foot in it, haven't I? After saying that there's no accurate portrait of Socrates in the early dialogues, I've now attributed the method that Plato has him use there to the historical Socrates. So I retract that. Your question is suddenly become meaningless to me. What's the biggest lesson that Plato learned from Socrates? We don't know. I'd have to say that, I think.
Well, people often say that the Platonic dialogues, especially the early ones, don't present any doctrines. They just, test ideas and refute them, and then everybody goes home confused, but more eager for better conversations in the future. But one of the parts of your book I found really fascinating was a compilation of doctrines from the early dialogues. Here are some. Virtue is knowledge. A good person's body may be harmed, but not their soul. It is never right to do wrong. It is never right to repay wrongdoing in kind. It is better to suffer injustice than to commit injustice. No one does wrong willingly. Everyone thinks that what they're doing is good for them, even though some people are objectively wrong about this. And there's a few more. So these are, as you say, these are very striking, counterintuitive, philosophically arrived at claims that we find in the early dialogues. Are these Socratic claims or are these Plato?
I have to say they're Plato's, because I think everything in all the dialogues is Plato's. As I've already indicated, I'm chary of attributing anything to the historical Socrates that we find in Plato or any of the other Socratic writers. But the way that Plato arrived at those ideas that you just read out is very interesting, because he didn't sort of argue for them so much as wait and see if they survived the argument. And because he was so keen on conversation, whether internal or external, as the philosophical method, then anything which remained unrefuted at the end of the conversation could be considered to be, if not true, then at least worth thinking about.
And I think this is why scientists, I find, like Plato so much, because that's the essence of the scientific method. You create as many hypotheses as possible to explain a certain phenomenon, and then you try to disprove them, and you knock them down one by one. And the one that's left standing, if you get one that's left standing, then you're lucky, and that's your working hypothesis, and then you keep that until you can knock it down. So I guess what you're saying is that these doctrines are the hypotheses that were not able to be disproved in the early dialogues. Is that right?
Exactly so. Remember what Sherlock Holmes said: when you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be true.
I love that. That's great.
I like it too, yeah.
Did Plato have other teachers in philosophy that were, very influential in his development? Do we know any of the names?
Cratylus taught him Heracliteanism, and I've forgotten the name of his other teacher in philosophy. They obviously weren't as influential as Socrates, although you can see it was somebody teaching him the Eleatic philosophy, a kind of monism.
Was that when he traveled to Italy, or did he have teachers in Athens?
This was at the same time as that he was attending Socrates' group. Okay,
so while attending Socrates' conversations, he was also fishing around for other ideas?
Absolutely. This was bog standard. That's what you did. I'm trying to think of another famous example. Zeno of Citium, who founded the school of Stoicism, came to Athens, studied in the academy a bit. Then he studied cynicism with Crates, and then I think he even attended a few Epicurean talks, and then he founded Stoicism. So that's what you did to round out your education.
So how did Plato come to the theory of forms? Is that something that he invented, or did he kind of synthesize it from ideas that were floating around?
Well, as I said, you can see Heraclitean and Parmenidean influences in the theory of forms. I'll explain that. How Plato came to the theory of forms essentially was an identification problem. How do we come to see that an action is right or that a chair is green? Because such properties he saw from the Heraclitean influence are unstable. What's right might be wrong in another society or at another time. What's green isn't green after dark and will fade over time. So he has Socrates. This is very much at the heart of those short early dialogues that we've mentioned. So Plato has his Socrates point out this instability and ask the people he's talking to, no, I want the one single thing makes all actions right or wrong, or a chair green, or whatever. And although it's not quite explicit in the early Socratic dialogues, there's a recent trend in scholarship to make Plato's Socrates out to be more of a metaphysician than he used to be thought. But at any rate, Plato developed this line of thinking into the theory of forms, because he said, okay, if there's nothing stable in the world, then there's nothing we can actually know in the world, because to know something for certain, it has to be unchanging, remain always as it is, as it was. So he hypostatized these unchanging things into what he called the forms. So he said, what enables us to identify a person as beautiful or an action as right is because we actually have, as it were, subliminal knowledge of the form of rightness and, the form of greenness.
Yeah. I'm curious if mathematics played a role in this, because, on the one hand, as you said, you had the Heracliteans who, maybe Heraclitus himself didn't think this, but at least by the time Plato was around, the Heracliteans were saying that everything is in flux, there's nothing stable in the world, etc. And then you also had Pythagoreans who had discovered principles of mathematics and said these principles, although not bodies, not corporeal things, you can't see them, these actually exist in a very meaningful sense and they're eternal. And so was he, in a sense, trying to find similar eternal principles in the moral space?
Yeah, not in the Pythagorean way. For them, numbers were sort of cosmological, at least not until Plato wrote Timaeus in the Pythagorean way. But just in the sense that 2 + 2 = 4 is an unchanging truth. There's, so that gave him a kind of a model of things that are unchanging, which he then transferred also to the forms. But I mean, the individual numbers were forms as well. So in doing 2 + 2 + 4, you're operating with forms.
Plato, as you write in your book, wrote about all these ideas, and he became famous during his own lifetime, which is a rare feat for a philosopher. And I'm curious, how does one become famous as an intellectual in ancient Greece? I mean, obviously, there's no printing press, there's no newspapers, there's no mass media. So how do you, I mean, I can understand how Plato would become famous in Athens, but how do you become known from Asia Minor to southern Italy as a philosopher at this time?
Let me start by saying that when you said that it's a rare feat for a philosopher to become famous in his own lifetime, that may apply to 20th century and 21st century philosophers who don't become household names at all, although Wittgenstein got close, I guess. But in ancient times, and previously in the sort of 18th, 17th centuries, the times of Locke and Hume and people like that, there were philosophers were well known as intellectuals. But in the ancient Greek world, philosophers were often very famous. Not necessarily for their philosophy purely, but just as intellectuals. And so, for instance, a city like Athens would use philosophers as ambassadors to other states. On one very, very famous occasion, they sent 3 philosophers on an embassy to Rome, and Rome was converted to philosophy. Before that, it had been, a rude republic, as it were. So, no, in his own lifetime, I think it was simply publishing and word of mouth.
But I mean, do you think his dialogues were already being read during his lifetime in faraway places that were also speaking Greek?
Yes, absolutely they were. As I've indicated, we can't necessarily trust everything we read in these ancient biographies, but they talk about Plato's dialogues being read. They talk about people being attracted to come to Athens and join the academy because they read. They talk about him sending. Yeah, he sent one of his pupils to Sicily, I think, but that was to get a book, not to. But it just shows that people went to great lengths to get books.
I mean, one of the strange things about Plato's books is that, most other authors at the time, or not most, but a lot of other authors at the time would embed a kind of watermark in their works. For example, Herodotus begins his histories by saying, Herodotus hereby writes blah, blah, blah. And Thucydides begins by saying, Thucydides, blah, blah, blah. And Sappho embeds her name in her songs. And then Plato, like, deliberately omits his name from everything except for, like, two notable exceptions, right? So, was he... On the one hand, you might think that's bad marketing, but obviously it worked. So maybe it's like brilliant marketing. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, okay, there are various reasons that we won't go into now, but I go into my book as to why Plato chose this peculiar strategy of making himself invisible in his works, like a playwright. Everybody knew they were by Plato, even if he doesn't pop up in them. He's mentioned 3 times, but only in 2 dialogues.
Like I remember in my freshman year of college, when we had to read the Symposium, a common reaction from students was, I don't get why Plato deserves any credit. He's just reporting other people's conversations, right? And then that's something that as you read more and more, you realize actually this is all the brilliant dramatization of Plato's own ideas. But I guess ancient authors were they must have been much more accustomed to this form of dialogue, so that when they received a Socratic dialogue, they didn't doubt for a moment that this actually was Plato's work on display. Right?
Well, I mean, again, we're back to that issue, Jack. I mean, they would have been in a position to know whether it was Socrates, whether it was an accurate portrait of Socrates, but I'm just saying that we aren't. So.
Okay, let's probe this a bit, because we have the Apology of Socrates by Plato, and we have the Apology of Socrates by Xenophon, and they're very different. Like, clearly, Socrates could not have said both of those things in his defense speech. So
there are common elements. There are a good dozen common elements to both speeches.
But in one of them, Socrates is like, I'm not even going to try to defend myself. And in the other one, he delivers like the most beautiful, eloquent argument imaginable.
While saying it's off the cuff. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So I'm just curious, like the people that were around at the time who remembered Socrates, would they have, like, how would they have reacted? Would they have said, oh, come on, this is not real? Or would they have said, oh, I love how you reimagined this. This is brilliant.
So it would be more that, because, as I said, lots of other Socratics were writing, and all the portraits were different. All the philosophies that they were putting in Socrates' mouth were different. So I think an educated audience would quite quickly have picked up on the fact that this was a form of fiction, a way to communicate your ideas.
One of the common elements of the Socratic dialogues is the appearance of the sophist who is challenged by Socrates. And the sophists today are presented as the kind of antagonists, the bad guys that Plato and Socrates are trying to defend against and refute. So what really distinguishes a sophist from Plato and Socrates? Are they really that different?
Socrates is very hard to distinguish from the sophists. And in his own day, he would have been called a sophist. Because that just meant, somebody who's clever and prepared to impart his ideas. That's really all sophist meant. But Plato, of course, is easy to distinguish from the sophists. He was a much more serious writer and was writing at greater length and so on and so forth. Plato tries, I think rather feebly, to drive a wedge between Socrates, and this is one of the true life things, one of the personal aspects of Socrates that almost certainly is historically true. So he tries to drive a wedge between Socrates and the sophists by saying that Socrates didn't teach for money, whereas the sophists did. But that really only makes Socrates not a professional wise man.
I mean, you have some very impressive sophists, though, right? I mean, you have
Protagoras.
You have Protagoras, who not only wrote a very well-received book, but also wasn't he commissioned to write the laws for some city-states and
Thurii.
Yes, and then you have, I forget, some of the sophists mentioned in the dialogue called Protagoras, who have compiled, dictionaries of interesting words, and these are interesting intellectuals, right?
Yeah. And Prodicus was certainly interesting. Hippias was interesting. I mean, one of his books we'd love to have survived. He did the first book of philosophical doctrines from predecessors. not at length. Most of these books were sort of short and dogmatic, but he wrote a little handbook that was used by subsequent authors on what earlier thinkers, philosophers, dramatists, whatever, had thought. So yeah, I'd love to have some of their books.
I want to test a theory on you, okay?
Okay.
So this is my theory of what distinguishes the Sophists from the later philosophers. The Sophists are the great intellectuals of the period of Athenian democracy up until the end of the Peloponnesian War. And as you point out in your book, during this time, Athens is attracting geniuses. You have all these superstar intellectuals from all over the Greek world, and they all come to Athens, and they make a lot of money, and they write books, and they deliver speeches, and they are all on board with the Athenian democratic project in some sense. Then Athens is humiliated in the war. It has a tyrannical government. Thousands are killed. And I think a lot of people looked back to those intellectuals and said, how did you lead us down this path? Couldn't you have warned us? You guys are the Sophists. You guys are the wisdom teachers. Couldn't you have seen some of these dangers? And then a new breed of intellectuals crops up, and they want to now lead Athens on a better path. So they have to distinguish themselves from the intellectuals that failed to do so. And so they create this new label. They standardize this label, Sophists, put it on them and say, no, we're different. We're going to lead Athens now on a better course, whether it's Plato leading it philosophically or whether it's Isocrates leading it towards an alliance with Macedon. Doesn't matter. Like, this is the new breed of intellectuals, and don't confuse us with those guys.
Well, okay, a couple of things. First of all, in my view, Isocrates was a sophist, and he was in the 4th century.
And I agree, but he writes against the Sophists.
Yeah,
so
well, he writes against people he calls the Sophists, but they're not the same. Yes. I think even the Socratics and Platonists were included in among the people he called the Sophists, although that's a fairly controversial view. But so, okay, Isocrates was a sophist. He wrote at much greater length than the Sophists. I mean, he wrote sometimes at somewhat tedious length, but he was still doing the same work. What I think distinguished the Sophists, to give my answer to that question, is from the philosophers particularly, is that their work, and Isocrates's, was meant to be practical. They were trying to turn people into good speakers, or make them moral enough to be political leaders, or writing books for people who enjoy history, like we mentioned Hippias's book, and so on. It was always practical, whereas what the Platonist was doing was almost entirely theoretical. So that would be my answer to the question. And also, you generalized a bit at one point and said that all the major 5th century sophists, you said all the major sophists were on board with Athenian democracy. Not so. Antiphon was one of the leaders of the oligarchic movement that tried to overthrow the democracy. And he was a sophist in the sense of a rhetoric teacher in particular, which was one of the core activities of the sophistic movement.
There is some debate, though, whether it's the same antiphon, right?
Yeah, but, there is. I think it is.
So, I mean, again, what I was saying is more of a statistical claim. Like, first of all, on the one hand, I agree with everything you said, that there's a substantive difference between the philosophical work and the sophist work. I also agree with you that Isocrates fits the sophist definition, but what I was saying is more of like a marketing perspective, like in the same way that Isocrates, who is arguably a sophist, he is attacking people he calls sophists. So you see this similar pattern of trying to label a group as the sophists, and I just think that there were some political dimensions to that.
Yeah, but he attacked people he called the sophists because he was trying to usurp the word philosophy. He called himself a philosopher, and he called what he taught philosophy. In direct opposition to Plato, for sure. Plato, he said that Isocrates thought Plato's type of philosophy was useless. Didn't turn out statesman.
Right. So let's continue on this point, because as you write in your book, Isocrates had, not to be confused with Socrates, it's not the Apple version of Socrates, Isocrates, but Isocrates had set up a rival school to the academy. And you write that there's some implicit attacks of Plato and Plato's school that you can find in Isocrates' work. So can you give us some examples of these attacks, just to get a sense of the rivalry?
Well, there are many, but they all center around that distinction that I've already made. The two different conceptions of philosophy.
So Plato's philosophy is useless.
Yeah.
The Academy teaches useless, abstract things. Come to me, and I'll make you a great statesman.
Exactly.
Okay.
And a lot of his books, that is the message of it. He was using his works as publicity.
Which institution was more expensive to attend?
Undoubtedly, Socrates is, because Plato didn't charge.
So Isocrates was like Harvard Business School. And
yes, yeah.
like, you pay a lot of money, but you're going to make a lot of money at the end.
Yeah.
At least that's the promise.
Whereas Plato nowadays would have been doing, multi-dimensional topography or something.
Maybe the Institute for Advanced Study.
Yeah. Okay.
How was Plato's school funded? Or actually, let's go back. What caused him to found the school, the academy, the first major such institution that we know of, and how did he then find the funds to develop it?
Well, I'm pretty sure he had been teaching for quite a while. I mean, since the 390s, he was teaching. When he was in his 20s, let's say. I think he wanted to found the academy just because he wanted to teach and to foster research. That's what went on there. So perhaps we can read that back as his motive, and again to surround himself with like-minded people.
Well, how did he fund it?
Well, partly by his own wealth. He kept his family estates all his life, so he still would have been getting a good income from them, and partly from generous donations by wealthy people like Dion, who was actually a Platonist, a follower, a member of the academy whenever he was in Athens, or like this chap we hear of, Antiquity, who was just a philosopher from a rival Socratic school, who paid Plato's ransom at one point. And when the Platonists say, "Look, we're going to pay you back," he said, "No," and so they put it towards founding the academy. So we know the academy was founded with a donation, and Dion probably gave Plato money for it from time to time. He was immensely rich. I mean, really, we're talking Bill Gates or Elon Musk or something by comparative standards.
Plato really aggressively recruited people, right? Like if you're traveling between Italy and the Aegean and you're trying to get the best mathematicians and philosophers and trying to get them all to actually pick up shop, move to Athens, and,
I don't know that he actively recruited very much. It was, again, as far as we can tell from the ancient biographies, it was simply the attraction of his mind, of his work, that drew people there. And the academy was clearly quite slow to start. We hear much more about it in like the 360s and 350s than we do when it started back in the late 380s and 370s. But
how confident are you that it was started in the 380s?
Very.
Yeah.
It ties in with that story about Antiquity, this Cyrenaic philosopher, because, okay, we haven't mentioned the story that possibly true story that Plato, in fact, I think largely true story that Plato was captured by pirates and put up for sale in a slave market. Okay, so his ransom was paid by Antiquity. We're told that Antiquity happened to be on this island, Aegina, where Plato was being held because he was on the way to Olympia for the Olympic Games. So we know that was 384. And then the end of the story, as I said before, was that they wanted to pay the money back, but Antiquity said, "Nah, don't worry." And so they put the money towards founding the academy. So next year, 383.
All right. Well, one of the brilliant minds that the academy attracted was Aristotle. Mm-hmm. And our sources tell us that Aristotle spent 20 years studying at the academy. So you'd think that he would have known Plato really well, and yet students of Aristotle are always puzzled by the fact that Plato is rarely mentioned. When he is mentioned, it's very dispassionately. There are often times where Aristotle will quote or allude to a passage in Plato, but say, as Socrates says, blah, 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 right? It doesn't sound like they were that close. I don't know. I mean, what do you think?
There are stories in the ancient biographies about a bit of tension between them towards the end of Plato's life. And they even elaborate on that and say that after Plato's death, I mean, Plato, before his death, had already nominated Speusippus to succeed him as head of the academy. And so the ancient biographers say that Aristotle left the academy after Plato's death, but did so in a huff, because he was the greatest mind, and so he expected to be chosen as the leader. But there were good reasons. I give them in my book why he wasn't chosen.
You don't think it was unfair that Plato nominated Speusippus instead of Aristotle?
No.
Okay.
No, not at all. He was the right man for the job. He was older than Aristotle. Aristotle was still in his 30s. Speusippus would have been in his 50s or 60s, I think, 60s. And mathematics was very much at the heart of what was going on in the academy. And Aristotle was not a good mathematician, but Speusippus was, or at least he was developing a mathematical kind of metaphysics type of Plato's theory of forms.
Also, I think that if a good teacher recognizes genius in a student, he's not going to just give the prize to that. Like, I think a good teacher would actually push his best student to venture off into new adventures. And so I think that Plato probably realized that Aristotle would never be content running someone else's school, and said, look, you're young, go off, learn more things, live life, and then create your own school. That's how I imagine it, at least. Yeah,
but having said someone else's school, it's very interesting that what we infer from the way the academy was run was that Plato kept himself very aloof. It was not in the slightest a school for the perpetuation of Platonism. He allowed researchers to get on with their own research, even when it directly contradicted, even the theory of forms. And you sometimes read in Aristotle him saying things like, why didn't Plato make this clearer? Aristotle was close to Plato for 20 years. I mean, was working in the academy for 20 years, as you said.
Yeah.
So
why didn't he ask him?
Yeah. Why didn't he ask him? Presumably he did. And Plato sort of said, no, you work it out for yourself, mate, or something like that. But anyway, I want to again slightly argue against part of your picture.
Okay.
It's true that Plato's name doesn't occur very often in Aristotle, and Socrates occurs more, but everybody, I mean, as far as we can tell, every time Aristotle mentions Socrates, is actually mentioning the Socrates of Plato's dialogues, or one of Plato's dialogues. So Plato is implicitly there, and more importantly, there are countless references to him when Aristotle says something like, some thinkers say that. And everybody reading the book in the first place would have said, oh yeah, Plato and some other academicians. So, okay, few explicit references, but many, many, many implicit ones. And not entirely without passion either. There's an interesting passage in, I think, the second book of the Nicomachean Ethics, where Aristotle's leading up to a criticism of an aspect of the theory of forms, the form of the good, because the good is relevant to the ethical treatise that he's writing. And he says, but this is awkward for me, because the people who came up with this theory are my friends. That's the only occasion I can think of.
Well, then there's the famous burn where he's like, our friends are dear, but the truth is dearer.
That's the same passage.
Yeah. So people often take that as like I think people exaggerate the supposed rivalry between Aristotle and Plato. I mean,
well, there's philosophical rivalry, clearly. Aristotle disagreed with pretty much all of Plato's most fundamental ideas.
But if you look at the
yeah.
entire landscape of ancient Greek philosophy, like all the schools, all the thinkers over the centuries, I think Plato and Aristotle are two contrasting sides of the same coin within that much larger mosaic. When you think about Plato, there's several things that just seem beyond belief. Like, one is that you get this succession. Socrates, greatest philosopher of his time, teaches Plato, greatest philosopher of his time, teaches Aristotle, greatest philosopher of his time, teaches Alexander, greatest conqueror of the ancient world. And then you have Plato's writings becoming so famous and uninterruptedly admired for all of history. And then his academy being the longest lived research institution of the ancient world. It's like, how did all this happen? I mean, there's so many incredible, I don't know what you call it, serendipities, coincidences. Like,
yeah, they are nice. But I have to say that I don't think there's a tiniest trace of Aristotle's teaching that we can see in Alexander. I mean, I don't think Aristotle said, go ahead and massacre as many people as you can.
Certainly no implementation of Aristotle's philosophical or ethics is easy to be discerned, but maybe just the exercise. I mean, actually, my advisor in grad school, Christian Wilberg, did a seminar in which they probed the question, what was Aristotle teaching Alexander? And most people think, oh, he was teaching him Nicomachean ethics and politics. Like, no, he was teaching him like Homer. He was reading the classic text that all the other students were reading. So
he was just getting the philosophers were again quite often used for this. Aristotle was not at all unique in that Macedonian kings would hire philosophers to become personal tutors to their sons, and they weren't teaching their particular core philosophy. They were just rounding off that person's education in the way that younger students, not the core researchers in the academy, would have attended just every now and again. They'd have gone to a talk and for a period of 2 or 3 years and rounding off their education, being able to put a bit of bite or wit perhaps into a conversation or something like that.
Now, you mentioned at some point in your book that Plato's Academy might have functioned in part as a kind of consulting agency, like McKinsey or BCG, some foreign... I don't know
these American names. Yeah. They're international names, but I don't know them.
A foreign government comes to you and says, hey, we're having some trouble. Can you send some advisors? Yeah,
interestingly, they were approaching the academy, but not because politics was particularly at the heart of what the academy was doing, because it wasn't. But so they approached these people just because they were brilliant and were educated and were expected to be able to cast the right kind of gaze on, the constitution you needed writing.
Was that a source of revenue, though? Did they make money by offering expert consultations?
Good question. Yeah, quite likely. But again, there's no record of it, but it seems quite possible.
Because I think both Plato and Aristotle sent their students to write laws for states that were either in trouble or being founded, right?
Did Aristotle?
Although interestingly, I'm pretty sure
Aristotle had his students describe the constitutions of a number of Greek states, but I don't know whether he sent them out as troubleshooters. I can't think. Okay,
well, Plato did, right?
Plato did, for sure, yeah.
But interestingly, he himself never assumed the role of the lawgiver.
Well, that's pretty much what he went to Syracuse for.
So you think he actually tried to implement reforms in Sicily?
Absolutely. Not himself, but by changing the character of the tyrant Dionysius II. Law was right at the center of the reform. He wanted Dionysius to stop being an absolute monarch and become a constitutional monarch. In other words, answerable to the law in certain respects, at any rate, just as much as anybody else was. So he did want him and perhaps his students to draft a new constitution for Syracuse, which didn't happen.
his meddling arguably contributed to a very chaotic period of civil wars in Syracuse.
I'm absolutely sure it did. I mean, Plato was so famous. I mean, that's what he was doing in the tyrant's court in the first place, because tyrants like to surround themselves with, intellectuals and dramatists and poets and writers of all sorts and everybody else. But Plato must have been one of the most famous people at his court, and Plato became very close to a relative by marriage of Dionysius, whose family was absolutely central to the Syracusan court, called Dion, who we've mentioned before. He was senior courtier.
Okay.
I don't know what we'd call him, chancellor, but a very senior courtier, a very wealthy person in his own right, and as I say, became very, very close to Plato. But everybody knew that Dion and Dionysius II were almost constantly at loggerheads. Dionysius II banished Dion away from Syracuse, confiscated his lands, stopped sending him any income. And this was all Plato was trying to negotiate on behalf of Dion while he was in Syracuse, but was getting nowhere. That was one of the reasons he got, fed up and left, not just the fact that Dionysius didn't have what it takes to be a philosopher. But everybody knew that Dion didn't like Dionysius II, and eventually that Dion had eyes on seizing political power himself, not perhaps to make himself a tyrant, but at any rate to get rid of Dionysius II, to overthrow him. So the fact that Dion and Plato were so close was implicit, fuel to Dion and his political friends. And Plato's nephew Speusippus joined Plato on one of his visits to Syracuse and acted as a kind of eyes and ears spy for Dion. He would go around, when he was invited out to a symposium or something in Syracuse, he'd sound people out to see whether they were in favor of joining Dion and overthrowing Dionysius II or not. So yeah, both Plato and Speusippus were responsible for some of the foment in Syracuse at the time, yeah.
Karl Marx famously quipped that it's finally time for philosophers to try changing the world and not just analyzing and describing it. But actually, in the ancient world, as we see, philosophers were very much changing the world, and Plato contributed to some very major upheavals in Sicily. And I guess his motivation was what? Did he actually believe that he could reform Syracuse into a more just polis?
Yes. Not on the model of the Republic. It would have been unrealistic for him to expect that. But he expected to change Dionysius II's character and goals in life, so that he would see the importance of getting a more democratic element going in the city and things like that.
So when that failed, how do you think that experience affected Plato's later works and later philosophy?
Well, it's a bit tenuous, but I do say in my book that there was an influence that, Plato was constantly writing political theory books, and two of them, Politicus or Statesman and Laws, definitely postdate his visits to Syracuse. And it's possible, not every scholar agrees with this at all, but I do in my book. I draw out perhaps some clues of a greater realism or pessimism than had characterized his earlier political writing.
Do you think that his shift from the Republic, which is his first description of an idealized society, to one of the last books he wrote, The Laws, which is kind of Republic 2.0, do you think that shift has to do with or was influenced by his experiences in Sicily?
Yes. And certain aspects of the constitution outlined in Laws is exactly what he wanted to put in place in Sicily as well. This mixture between a commanding element and a democratic element answerable to the laws, which is why the book's called The Laws.
Yeah. Let's perhaps wrap up by considering the end of Plato's life. And, he spent much of his career following what's been taken as the Socratic position that philosophers should kind of lower their gaze from the heavens and focus on the human realm, focus on ethics, politics. And yet, at the end of his life, Plato lifted his gaze back up to the cosmos and spent his final years thinking about the movement of the stars and the planets and everything. So what do you think caused that shift?
Oh, the academy. One of the most important people, I would say the second most important after Aristotle, who was a research student at the academy, was a man called Eudoxus of Cnidus. In fact, he brought, when he joined the academy, he came as a visitor once, and then a few years later he came with his fellow researchers, and they all joined the academy. He was the most significant mathematical astronomer for many centuries. So that was the kind of work that was going on in the academy.
There is this idea that gets picked up by the Stoics after Plato's death and later philosophers that when you kind of harmonize yourself with the cosmos, that creates this happy resonance state. Is that detectable in Plato's late works, that he was moving in that direction, that part of the motivation for astronomy is to actually align your soul with the heavens?
Well, in a very abstract way, yes, because, he wanted, it's difficult to explain this because, there's a lot of underlying theory here, but he wanted the motions in our soul, in our psyche, to be the same as those that were detected in the planets and the heavenly bodies.
All right. Well, we've covered a lot of ground. I'd like to wrap things up by asking you, when you were writing this book, what was the, I guess, most surprising thing that you discovered in researching Plato's life?
Well, very little, really, because, I've been dipping into and out of Plato for 50 years. But I think the area where I had to do most research, and that was therefore interesting and exciting, was the academy. I didn't know so much about the characters and the work of the early academy as I do now, and so that was really interesting to explore. And I hope that readers find it interesting as well.
Yeah, well, having Speusippus be like a kind of secret James Bond, like a secret agent, like James Bond, that's pretty cool. All right, Robin Waterfield, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Well, thanks again for having me.